shaking in my boots about the future is defending democracy at home and abroad. And so when I was looking around for a plenary speaker, I said to myself, there's got to be a comparativist out there who studies this and has translated this into some thoughts about the United States. And sure enough, we found him. And so it is my pleasure to introduce to you tonight Stephen Fish, who is a comparative political scientist who specializes in democracy and authoritarianism, religion and politics, constitutional systems, and national legislatures. His most recent book is Comeback: Routing Trumpism, Reclaiming the Nation, and Restoring Democracy's Edge, published in 2024, this past semester. Previously, he published Are Muslims Distinctive? A Look at the Evidence, which was selected for Choice's Outstanding Academic Titles in 2012, top 25 books. He is also author of Democracy Derailed in Russia, The Failure of Open Politics, which was the recipient of the Best Book Award of 2006, presented by the Comparative Democratization section of the American Political Science Association, and Democracy from Scratch: Opposition and Regime in the New Russian Revolution. He is co-author of the Handbook of National Legislatures, a Global Survey, and Post-Communism and the Theory of Democracy. Fish writes and comments extensively on international affairs and the rising challenges to democracy in the United States and around the world. He appears on BBC, CNN, and other major networks, and has published in the New York Times, Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, the American Interest, the Daily Beast, Slate, and Foreign Policy. He has served as an expert consultant to U.S. federal agencies and international organizations, such as the European Commission for Democracy, through law. Fish studied international relations, economics, and history at Cornell and the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies before receiving his PhD in political science from Stanford. In addition to UC Berkeley, he has taught at the University of Pennsylvania and universities in Russia, Poland, China, and Indonesia. He served as a senior Fulbright Fellow and visiting professor at the Airlangga University, Surabaya, Indonesia, and at the European University at St. Petersburg, Russia. He has also been the recipient of the Distinguished Social Sciences Teaching Award of the College of Letters and Science at Berkeley. Will you all please join me in welcoming Dr. Fish?
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, Jennifer. Can everybody hear me okay without a mic? Or do I need to put a mic on? Mic would be helpful? All right.
Thank you.
You bet. Okay, does this help? All right. Okay, so why Trump? Why Trump? Sorry, this is the sign. Yes. Just, so I need some help with this. Is it better now? No problem. Okay. All right. Okay. So as I said, why Trump? Okay, so there's a standard story out there that we tend to believe, right? In fact, I bet most people here actually believe some version of this story. And that is this: the early post-war decades were a golden era for prosperity and class justice and democracy. Between 1945 and 1980 or so, the economy grew briskly, the middle class expanded apace. Job security and satisfaction were high. Income differentials were low. The Democrats pursued progressive economic policies that differed starkly from what the Republicans offered. We stuck with the working people and they stuck with us. But the golden age then began to wane. Ronald Reagan turned away from responsible conservatism, hollowing out social programs to fund tax cuts for the rich. The economy began to experience periods of prolonged stagnation. And even when it grew, the top earners captured all the gains. Income inequality escalated thereafter relentlessly. The increasingly knowledge-based economy created all kinds of opportunities for the well-schooled. But for people who lacked a higher education, anxieties began to mount as frustrations about job security, quality of employment, and so on ed. Satisfaction with work, in fact, flagged. He used to manufacture the finest steel in the world, but now he's making lattes. He and his wife used to feel like they were in the middle of the pack and had plenty of room to rise. But now they felt the American dream was fading, and under such pressure, the folks' prejudices grew. The golden age then gave way to the gilded age of the 1980s to the present. Rightists like Ronald Reagan and Newt Gingrich might have actually gotten things started, but neoliberal-friendly Democrats like Bill Clinton and Barack Obama only extended it. Enter Trump, the outsider. He blamed the struggles of working and middle-class folks on minorities, foreign exporters, immigrants, and out-of-touch liberal elites. Whites who lacked a college education in particular found Trump's blame game compelling, and the result was Trump's shocking 2016 victory and the rise of authoritarianism in the United States ever since. Now, steeped in this standard story, liberals often conclude that the way to reverse the drift toward Trumpism is to return to the ways of a bygone era when we focused more resolutely on the working man's jam. Now, this is the story that so many of us believe. When I investigated it, however, I found far less evidence for it than I'd expected. Since the early 1990s, economic growth has actually been robust compared to analogous situations in other countries. The notion that all the gains went to the top actually is not justifiable. Median, not average per capita income in the United States, actually rose by 50% between 1980 and 2017. And during Obama's second term, which of course is the term that just preceded Trump, median income in the United States actually rose faster than it had under any other presidential administration. Income inequality did rise during the Reagan period and the George W. Bush period, but after Bill Clinton terminated Reaganism in 1993, the Gini coefficient, that measure of economic inequality, flatlined. And it was the same in 2017 as it was in 1993, and it remains at the same level today. In terms of middle and working class welfare, America's record looks very good in comparative perspective compared to other rich countries, including those in which democracy has not come under threat at all. The purported convergence of the Democrats and the Republicans on neoliberal economics, I found very little justification for, either in terms of policies or rhetoric. What about subjective perceptions of welfare? So I looked at the General Social Survey, and I looked at questions on job security, happiness, job satisfaction, a battery of other questions. What I found was not this continuous downward trend that I'd expected. I was looking especially at working class whites. And I expected kind of a downward trend where white working class morale, underwent decline over the decades. What I found instead, though, were flat and in some cases rising lines going back from the 1970s until 2017 and after. So did social attitudes change in a way that would have helped Trump? Not really. There's been a relentless liberalization in American social attitudes on gender, sexual orientation, race, and other aspects of cultural politics. Our attitudes have liberalized really quite dramatically. What's more, I noticed that in other countries where illiberal demagogues who threaten democracy won elections, economies had actually been doing quite well, including in the years right before they came to power. Poverty had been falling, economic inequality had not been rising in some of these countries. These include Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, India, Brazil, and the Philippines. But I found a commonality across these countries. From Trump here to Viktor Orban in Hungary to Narendra Modi in India to Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines, illiberal demagogues who came to power cast themselves as indomitable doers of great things who would not be swayed by public opinion or short-term political consideration. Many of these leaders also claim superiority as protectors and patriots. They seized their national flags, but for the most part, I found that such leaders succeeded only where democracy's defenders had acquired reputations as petitioners of public opinion rather than strong leaders, and only where they had become squeamish about nationalism and forfeited their national flags to their illiberal opponents. So the evidence turned my attention away from the usual economic and cultural, in other words, structural factors that social scientists so love to focus on, and toward political factors, including political leadership. As I examined the evidence from the United States and other cases, I came to see one thing very clearly. Politics is a dominance game and a contest to capture the flag. Politicians who seem to be the strongest leaders and the most ardent patriots hold the advantage. And here in the United States, the Republicans never forget it. So let's focus on one aspect of my argument, which is dominance. Dominance is a way or a style of leadership. A few political psychologists have studied dominance in politics, but for the most part, the idea has received next to no attention in political science. So the concept I'm going to give you is my own invention. Unfortunately, to the extent that liberal politicians and activists and liberals in general have considered what I'll call dominance politics, we tend to regard it as a dirty business that's best left to the bad guys. But dominance politics is inherently neither good nor bad. How it's deployed is up to its user. What's more, it's not a male thing. Women can practice dominance politics every bit as much as men can. The reason dominance is so important is that it wins elections. And without overmatching democracy's enemies on dominance, Democrats are going to keep losing and democracy is going to perish. So in a nutshell, high dominance leadership is opinion shaping and conflict embracing. It inclines to the language of the aggressor, the righteous, and the triumphant. Low dominance leadership is opinion taking and conflict averse, and it inclines to the language of the aggressed upon and the endangered. So opinion shaping means basically just striving to mold opinion. The archetypal high dominance leader crafts a narrative that casts himself and his allies and his forebears as intrepid, successful protagonists. He asks not, what do the people want to hear, but rather, what do I want the people to believe? His message does not shift in sync with public opinion or in response to his opponent's actions. In addition to being reality shaping, the high dominance leader is conflict embracing, especially when facing aggressive opponents. She is happiest on the attack and chafes at playing defense. She seeks to win big and win outright, not just to avoid loss. She is risk acceptant rather than risk averse. She makes it about herself rather than trying to turn every contest into a referendum on her opponent. To the extent that she focuses on her opponent, she basically does so to deride him and pull him down. She doesn't build up her opponent by treating him like a frightening monster who everybody should be terrified of and offended by. She also recognizes that politics is always about us versus them. And she decidedly does not shrink from othering her political opponents. The high dominance leader's language reflects her opinion shaping and conflict embracing orientation. She uses the argot of onslaught and conquest. Embracing provocative parlance, she sometimes uses transgressive language. Above all, everything she does and says conveys confidence, optimism, and exuberance. So, how then do we see dominance politics playing out in the United States today? In archetypal, exaggerated form that provides no room for nuance, here's what we've been watching for the better part of the past decade. The Republicans strive to make opinion. The Democrats take it. When their opinion doesn't move their way, the Republicans double down. The Democrats back down. The Republicans pursue even unpopular policies with abandon. The Democrats often refrain from defending even popular policies lest the polls turn against them. The Republicans act as if their policies have more support than they actually have. The Democrats act as if their policies have less. The Republicans tell voters what they think. The Democrats tell voters what they think they want to hear. The Republicans treat even petty wins as conquests. The Democrats are loath to even treat their own transformational feats as something that they're willing to trumpet and claim credit for. The Republicans savor conflict. The Democrats find us versus them politics distasteful. The Republicans play offense. The Democrats play defense. When the Republicans say something controversial, they double down. When the Democrats cause a stir, they walk it back. The Republicans attack, the Democrats react. The Republicans embrace risk and play to win. The Democrats abhor risk and hope not to lose. The Republicans' messaging tries to stoke their own base. The Democrats' messaging strives not to stoke the Republican base. The Republicans use entertaining, provocative, aggressive language. Trump calls his opponents weak, lame, pathetic, disloyal, unpatriotic, disgraceful, and disgusting. The Democrats call Trump callous, unfair, ruthless, terrifying, heartless, scary, and offensive. The Democrats call the Republicans bullies and leave them in charge of the playground. This, in fact, is a relatively new phenomenon. The liberals who controlled the political arena during much of the 20th century were paradigmatic, high dominance politicians. FDR, JFK, LBJ, and MLK were examples. Nobody owned those bosses. Much the same can be said of Bill Clinton. These leaders used their dominant skills to enact practically every piece of progressive legislation that their low dominance successors are now fighting a rearguard action to save today. It's hard to measure dominance, but it can be proxied by the concept of strong leadership or toughness or decisive leadership. So during presidential election years, the American National Election Studies asks respondents to assess candidates' traits. One question reads, think about the Democratic Republican presidential candidate. In your opinion, does the phrase provide strong leadership describe the candidate extremely well, quite well, not too well, or not well at all? In every election, since the item was added to the survey in 1980, the candidate that enjoyed the advantage in perceptions of strength won. The surveys also ask respondents if they think each candidate is knowledgeable. In half of the elections in which candidate was seen as more knowledgeable, he prevailed. And in half, he or she lost. The survey also asks respondents whether candidates really care about people like you. The candidate who's seen as caring won 5 times and lost 4 times. Strength never loses. Knowledgeable and caring lose about half the time. We see the same thing in abundance of other surveys. On likability, honesty, moral character, caring about people like you, Trump almost always loses. But he always wins on strength, and that is his superpower. The Democrats still think that voters make their decisions based on candidates' issue stances, on policy proposals, qualifications for office, compassion and commitment to fairness. Trump knows better, which is why he keeps winning, even though voters consistently prefer the Democrats' policy positions on everything from taxes to guns to abortion to teaching about racism in the schools. So let's take a light at the recent election in light of these realities. The campaign and the election's outcome provide proof of concept for everything I've told you so far. In the half year or so prior to his withdrawal from the race, as we recall, Biden had become the model of a low dominance politician. His campaign relied on vapid ads about Trump's purported threat to affordable prescription drugs and complaints about how much Trump lies. Biden also relentlessly tried to turn the election into a referendum on Trump, which is a hallmark of a low dominance politician. Unsurprisingly then, even though Biden was doing a great job with policy and the economy was doing well, Trump consistently ran ahead of Biden in the polls, even before Biden's disastrous debate performance on June 27th. Then, as you'll all recall, on July 21st, Biden withdrew, and Harris stepped up and assumed the party's mantle by default. Doubts about her swirled, as you probably remember. But within a week of her launch, she had made Democrats believers, and talk of replacing her with a stronger candidate ceased. So what changed? The answer is that from the moment she stepped out, she was the boss. She projected a spirit of ebullient optimism and promised victory and no retreat. Her early rallies were boisterous celebrations with immense crowds. Trump melted down as he complained bitterly that he'd been the victim of a bait and switch on the part of the Democrats. No wonder the poor dear was so distraught. For the first time ever, his opponent was canceling his dominance advantage. Harris didn't try to make the election a referendum on Trump at first. To the extent that she dealt with Trump at all, she left behind the Democrats' typical habit of treating Trump as some 800-pound gorilla who we should all be terrified and offended by. Instead, as you recall, she and her vice presidential running mate, Tim Walz, treated Trump like an impetuous toddler in need of a timeout. Leveraging her career as a public prosecutor, Harris aggressively pursued a prosecutor versus felon narrative, boasting that she spent her days prior to entering politics putting people like Trump behind bars. The Democratic National Convention in August, as you recall, was a raucous, star-spangled Harris coronation, with some of the party's highest dominance assets, among them Jasmine Crockett, Andy Beshear, Gretchen Whitmer, J.B. Pritzker, and Wes Moore making primetime center stage speeches. Harris's acceptance speech featured a hard-edged pledge of commitment to defense of American interests and its allies in the face of challenges from our foreign enemies, whose leaders also just happen to be Trump's best foreign friends. Then on September 10th, don't you remember the day? Harris whipped Trump so badly in the presidential debate that Trump refused to even consider having a second one. Harris cast Trump not as a terrifying, imperious liar, but rather as insecure and tiresome and small. Playing on Trump's crowd size obsession, she invited viewers to attend a Trump rally, telling them they would see crowds thinning out early as bored spectators headed for the exits. A stammering Trump responded, as you might remember, "We had the biggest rallies, the most incredible rallies in the history of politics." And then he went on to spout his lines about immigrants gobbling up people's dogs and cats in Springfield, Ohio. He was melting down. Rather than just calling Trump a friend of dictators, Harris got deliciously derisive. She mentioned it is well known that he exchanged love letters with Kim Jong-un and pointed out if Donald Trump were president, Putin would be standing in Kiev right now. Turning to Trump, she said that America's enemies were rooting for you, since they can manipulate you with flattery and favors. And that is why so many military leaders who have worked with you have told me you are a disgrace. While Trump was talking, as you might recall, Harris alternated between gazing at him with bemusement and then kind of looking away as if to avoid bursting out laughing. Trump, for his own part, stared straight ahead, gripping the podium and never even turning his eyes to the woman who was humiliating. Harris's campaign strategy was working. Not only did she pull ahead of Trump, but polls showed that most voters expected her to win. Underlying her remarkable surge was the disappearance of Trump's dominance advantage. That's what really happened. Polls taken at the time Harris entered the race showed Trump with a gaping advantage in voters' perceptions of strength and toughness and decisiveness, which is an edge that Trump also enjoyed over Biden before he withdrew from the campaign. But by mid-September, some surveys were showing that in fact, Harris was now perceived as every bit as strong and tough and decisive as Trump was. But then after roughly 7 weeks of successful campaigning that left Harris rising and Trump sputtering, Harris lost her mojo. I bet you can remember the change in vibe at the time. The reason was that fretting, calculating, obsessing over poll data, and dodging risk supplanted moxie and exuberance in Harris's campaign. Once Harris began granting interviews after the debate, she dodged and deflected, foregoing the opportunity to define herself and leaving herself open to suspicions that she lacked the courage of her convictions. Her answers were so scripted, so banal, and so repetitive that they hardly merited news coverage, and they, for the most part, didn't receive much of it. Take her October 7th 60 Minutes interview. This was typical of her post-mid-September behavior. Bill Whitaker asked her how millions and millions of Americans could support a man who she called a racist. This question was a lie, but she evaded the question, leaving Whitaker to ask it again. She dodged again, offering something about Trump being a divider and Americans wanting a uniter, not a divider. She could have given an answer that would blunt perceptions of liberal condescension, seize the flag, earn herself a reputation as a bold truth teller, and crush Trump's dominance game. Something like this. Of course, Trump is a racist and therefore an enemy of the United States. But most of those who voted for him aren't racist. What they love about him is his ability to own the libs. But nobody owns this lib. No wonder he chickened out of a second debate. Did you see me whip him in the first one? And why are we even talking about Trump anyway? Biden smoked him 4 years ago, and I'm going to smoke him in 4 weeks. Americans would have gotten to see what we long for the most, which is a real leader, someone who tells the truth and is up to her ears in vitality, the courage of her convictions, and confidence in herself and her fellow Americans. Instead, though, avoiding risk and provocation, he'd become the name of Harris's campaign's game. Except for her Fox News appearance, Harris refused to grant interviews to hosts who might have pushed her outside her comfort zone. Nowhere was this problem more apparent than in her non-response to Trump's appearances on so-called manosphere podcasts. Harris could have ridiculed Trump's appearances on the more extreme manosphere podcasts, calling them his outreach to incels tour, perhaps, not just to spotlight his misogyny, but to ridicule his small-handed, insecure manhood, all while she accepted invitations from the more mainstream manosphere podcasters like Joe Rogan, and charmed their audiences with her wit and verve. That was all possible and eminently doable for somebody like Kamala Harris, but she passed on every opportunity. Rogan had earlier eviscerated Trump in a raft of public statements, but when he invited Trump to appear, Trump jumped a plane to Austin, sat down with Rogan, and gave him 3 hours without insisting on preconditions. The Harris campaign imposed so many preconditions on Rogan by insisting that he not bring up certain topics and ask her questions on certain matters that the interview never came off. Trump also declined multiple invitations to appear on Lex Fridman's podcast. Fridman brings science to the masses, and he's known for his very respectful approach to guests, and he has a predominantly male audience. For his own part, Trump took Fridman up on his invitation and spent an hour mixing it up with him. Rogan's podcast with Trump garnered 37 million YouTube views within 72 hours of being posted. Fridman's podcast with Trump garnered 6 million views. But Harris restricted her podcast appearances to meetings with decidedly obliging figures who had little reach outside her primary audience and supporters. Her top podcast appearance on Call Her Daddy never cracked 1 million views. By mid-October, the fruits of such exquisite risk aversity were coming into focus. Trump had recovered his footing and was bulldozing the Democrats. By that time, it was abundantly clear that the data-drunk, oh-so-careful message curators who had already run Biden's campaign into the ground had asserted themselves in Harris's campaign's messaging. Trump hammered at a handful of themes, preeminently, of course, the so-called crisis at the border, Harris's earlier statements advocating decriminalization of illegal border crossings, and Harris's purported commitment to blurring the distinction between the genders. As the airwaves in swing states filled with Trump's ads skewering Harris's supposed wokeness that ended with, Kamala is for they, them. Trump is for you. Team Harris offered no response. Instead, sitting on gargantuan piles of vacuous data, they turned the campaign's ad effort into a scatter of minutely targeted pandering and alarm sounding, along with endless mind-numbing invocations of Harris's stellar middle-class credentials. After the election, the Trump campaign's chief pollster told reporters from Rolling Stone that while we knew what our campaign message was, the Democrats didn't. He cited the fact that while the Harris campaign ran 162 unique ads across all platforms, the Trump campaign ran only 50 and spent the same amount of money on them. Another Trump campaign official remarked that the Democrats' message, quote, differed almost from day to day, but definitely week to week. And that's no way to build a brand, especially over a short period of time, or to tell a story. Consultants from Super PAC Future Forward, which spent $500 million supporting the Democratic ticket, seem to agree. Rolling Stone reported the way they tell it, the campaign would test every ad and then throw whatever scored the highest up on TV and the internet, even when those ads did not amount to a single coherent narrative about the candidate. As a result, according to one Democratic strategist, Trump's ads packed a punch and were memorable, while the Harris campaign's ad-by-ad testing and hyper-data-driven approach were anathema to overarching storytelling. The Democrats never even began to formulate a response to Trump's assault on Harris for having advocated the decriminalization of border crossings. The lines campaign operatives fed Harris on immigration were both so obviously the product of focus group testing and so inappropriate as to have been risible. When queried on the issue, the candidate, Harris, ever intoned, our immigration system is broken. That's exactly the kind of line that would draw, thumbs up in focus groups. But coming from an incumbent vice president, who together with their boss had presided over immigration policy for the better part of the last 4 years, audiences could be forgiven for scratching their heads when they heard it. Harris trotted out that line practically every time she was asked on immigration. She did so in her 60 Minutes interview. And then when pressed, she noted that Biden had recently signed an executive order to fix the border problem, and the congressional Republicans had rejected that measure. When gently prodded again by the interviewer, who noted that maybe there actually had been a little rise in undocumented border crossings early in Biden's presidency, and then asked Harris, might you have been just a little bit slow to respond? Harris said the problem predated Biden, and it was Congress's responsibility to act. Her approach just led to more embarrassing questions about immigration rather than getting the monkey off her back. To many voters, and not just Republicans, she also created the impression of cravenness. Meanwhile, Trump kept pounding away at his BS about the border crisis, and he dominated news coverage as he did. And his poisonous story about immigrants poisoning the blood of our country took hold. As usual, Trump focused on making opinion, and he did, in fact, reshape it. On immigration, Harris could have said, "You live and learn. Joe and I wanted to get this right, and we weren't going to separate kids from their parents and put these tear-soaked toddlers in cages like Trump did. So we did our homework, we took action, and now there are fewer illegal border crossings than there were under Trump. We might have been slow, but then we got it right. Next question." In other words, she could have sucked the power of Trump out of Trump's demagoguery with a kind of disarming mea culpa, a display of capacity for learning, and then followed with a forceful declaration of victory. Trump also could have defended immigration by drawing on the rhetoric of Frederick Douglass or Presidents Johnson or Reagan. She could have told a stirring story of a nation whose cultural and economic preeminence in the world rested on the continuous process of minting new Americans. She could have echoed Reagan by proclaiming, "If we ever close the door to new Americans, our leadership in the world would soon be lost." She could have joined him by proclaiming, as Reagan said in his final words in office, that new Americans understand in a special way how glorious it is to be an American. They renew our pride and gratitude in the United States of America, the greatest, freest nation in the world, the last best hope of man on earth. Apparently that was too risky. And what would progressive voters have thought about all that flag waving and invoking Reagan anyway? Harris's messaging on the economy also left voters vulnerable to Trump's lies about the superiority of his economy. It also stoked suspicions about Harris's lack of audacity and her ability to add anything to what Biden had already done. Practically every time the subject of the economy arose in Harris's interviews and public statements during the second half of her campaign, she led by expressing sympathy for supposedly sorely straitened voters. And then she played Santa Claus. "I'll give you a $25,000 down payment assistance for first-time home buyers, a $50,000 tax credit for those starting their first businesses, a $6,000 tax credit for newborns." Never mind that approach fell to an awful lot of voters, and with some reason, like pandering, and that none of those policies actually, promised to benefit any more than a tiny portion of the electorate anyway. And for fear of offending all those poor middle-class people who were supposedly hurting so badly under her and Biden, Harris even refused to answer the question of whether she thought Americans were better off then than they had been 4 years earlier. Instead, Harris could have said something like this: "You're goddamn right, we're better off now than we were 4 years ago. Back then, unemployment was 15%, higher than during the Great Depression. Under me and Biden, it's been under 4% for the last 3.5 years. That's the lowest since the 1960s. COVID alone pushed inflation up, but Biden and I hammered it back down to under 3%, just where the Fed's supposed to be. Our economy is leaving the other rich economies in the world in the dust. It's growing faster than all of them. Real wages have been growing for 1.5 years running, every single month. New business startups and corporate profits are surging. The Dow is setting records. When Trump left office, the Dow was 31,000. Today it's 42,000. And oh, by the way, the budget deficit is half of what it was when Trump left office. Dream on, Cheeto. But you ain't seen nothing yet. We're going to make Biden's good economy look like Herbert Hoover's. No more kids in poverty in the richest, greatest country in the world. Watch for the Dow to break 50,000 under me. Why the hell not? We never heard anything like that from Harris. Her approach to Trump shifted as well during the second half of her campaign. The take no prisoners prosecutor versus felon narrative seemed to fade. It's hard to determine why, but Harris did come in for a raft of criticism from the far left for, you guessed it, unfairly stigmatizing felons. Perhaps worst of all, the dismissiveness and the derision and the entertaining ridicule that had grabbed headlines of Trump, that had grabbed headlines and so flummoxed Trump, gave way to defensive, low dominance habit of amplifying Trump's every outrageous statement and then indignantly calling on voters to join her in being good and defended. You might remember that during the closing weeks of the campaign, a particular version, reversion to form that took an almost pathetic air actually ended up infecting Harris's campaign. You might remember that some comedian at a Trump rally called Puerto Rico a floating island of garbage. Harris whisked Jennifer Lopez to her side, and for day after day, during the precious final days of the campaign, bore down on repeating Trump's statement and calling on Hispanics to join her in being outraged. After Trump said, "I'm going to do it whether women like it or not. I'm going to protect women," Harris spent precious days during the last week of the campaign highlighting Trump's remark and trying to stoke voters' umbrage. Same old, same old. Trump flicks the laser pointer and the Democrats play the cats. Tim Walz, who, as you know, Harris brought on her campaign as her vice presidential running mate on the strength of his references to Trump and the Republicans as creepy and weird, turned out to be a one-trick pony who had nothing else to say. As a result, journalists focused on what? On Walz's decades-old misstatements, representing his military rank falsely claiming he had served in a war he didn't serve in, and insinuating his family had used in vitro fertilization when they hadn't. Rather than change the topic by offering hard, fresh newsmaking zingers impaling Trump and Vance, Walz ended up devoting his interviews to apologizing for all his misstatements and berating himself for being a knucklehead with a bad memory. In early March, just a few weeks ago, having been sent back to St. Paul by voters 4 months earlier, and now witnessing the rapid-fire dismantlement of democracy by the men who beat him, Walz declared of his and Harris's campaign, "We shouldn't have been playing this thing so safe." You think? What did voters think as they went to the polls? Bearing in mind that a core feature of the high dominance politician, as I define her, is that she seeks to win outright and big, not just avoid loss. She is risk acceptant, not risk averse. We can examine data from the AP North survey conducted the week leading up to the election through election day. The survey included 4 questions about voters' assessments of the personal traits of the candidates. The first question was on whether the candidates were honest and trustworthy. The gap between positive and negative scores on that item advantaged Harris by 10 points. The second question asked whether the candidates had the mental capacity to serve as president. Advantage Harris, again by 10 points. The third question asked whether the candidates had the moral character to be president. Harris wins again by 17 points. But the fourth question asked whether the candidate was a strong leader. Trump wins by 19 points, which is to say Harris led in every other metric, but the spectacular gains she had made against Trump's dominance game during the first half of her campaign had subsequently been reversed. As you can see, my explanation for the election's outcome, like my explanation for how we got Trump to begin with, is all about leadership and messaging. And in fact, no other explanation will do. It wasn't the economy, stupid. The economy could not have been better for the Democrats at the time of the election, although, as I've argued, Harris's messaging on the economy certainly could have been much stronger. Nor did the Democrats lose middle and working class voters by pursuing policies that neglected their interests. Biden enacted a slew of progressive programs, including the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, and the Chips and Science Act, just to name a few, that pumped money into working and middle-class people's pockets. Those measures arguably added up, when added to other things Biden did, to the greatest crush of progressive legislation this country has seen since Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. To the extent that he was able, within the constraints of Republican intransigence, Biden governed to the left of most social democrats in Europe. Nor was Trump, to say the least, a popular, unbeatable opponent. During his first term, he suffered from the lowest average monthly approval rating of any president since Gallup started polling in the 1940s. And Trump departed office at 34%, lower than the 40% Biden would leave office with just a couple months ago. Did Biden withdraw from the race too late, thereby leaving Harris with too little time to mount an effective campaign? There's no way to know for sure. But at roughly the midpoint of her 15-week campaign, as I mentioned, Harris was soaring on the strength of a distinctly higher dominance approach than Biden had offered prior to stepping aside. If the election had been held at that time, Harris's prospects for victory arguably would have been much greater than they were at the time the election was held. In fact, 7 weeks later. Do sexism and racism account for Harris's defeat? Well, the gender gap actually shrunk in 2024 compared to 2020. Harris experienced more extensive losses among women than among men. In terms of ethnic demographics, Trump won exclusively on the strength of his gains among non-white voters. White voters actually shifted by a couple of percentage votes to Harris compared to 2020. But among blacks, the Democratic candidate's advantage narrowed by 2 points. Among Asian Americans, by 13 points. Among Hispanics, by a whopping 27 points. The good news, if my assessment is on target, is that the Democrats hold the keys to their own future and the future of democracy in the United States. Their fate does not rest on the price of eggs, nor hopes that bigotry in the electorate will wane, nor whatever Trump does or doesn't do. Nor does it depend on painstakingly adjusting our issue positions to those of the ever-elusive median voter. Democrats aren't going to agree, what's more, on policies on regulatory issues or trans athletes. And it doesn't matter that they don't. We don't need a unified message on the issues. What matters is that our leaders fire up Democrats, cow Republicans, and impress the unaffiliated by finally showing that they are mighty fighters who have the courage of their convictions and don't give a fuck what anybody else thinks. Think about it. The reason Bernie Sanders and AOC are drawing immense crowds, even in small towns, wherever they go in the United States right now, isn't because everybody's so committed to their socialist ideals. And the reason we're so mesmerized by Cory Booker's speech in Congress has nothing to do with what he actually said. What's so inspiring about these figures is their fury, their indomitability, and their taste for political combat. If the Democrats are ever to have hope for routing Trumpism, we will have to seek similarly high dominance figures to lead the party and become its public face. Those figures do not include the likes of Chuck Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries. They might do a good job of managing their party in their respective congressional bodies, but these figures do not make a fighting face for the Democratic Party. Risk aversion is the name of their game. But we do have such high dominance figures. Senators Adam Schiff and Ruben Gallego, Representative Jasmine Crockett, Rahm Emanuel, the former mayor of Chicago, Governors Josh Shapiro, Gretchen Whitmer, Amy Pritzker, and Andy Beshear. These are examples. These people vary widely in their personal styles, from the kind of hot sauce and sass of Jasmine Crockett to Adam Schiff's scholarly demeanor. But they are all united by their uncompromising democratic passions, commitments to shaping opinion rather than just telling voters what they think they want to hear, their willingness to ruffle feathers, and their understanding that playing defense is for losers. They're also united by their taste for MAGA blood. Other figures are going to arise as well, names we haven't even heard of before, and we have to be ready to embrace them. And there's so much we can do right now ourselves. Like every other authoritarian, Trump is going after the universities, taking us off one by one, and it's working. We've been hunkered down in a defensive crouch, trying to hide our DEI programs and tone down the criticism of Trump in the vain hope of appeasing him. But that policy of appeasement will have the same effect on Trump as Trump's appeasement of his owner and mentor, Vladimir Putin, does. The reality is that our universities are the best things America's got. More than half of the world's top universities are located in the United States. We dominate the world in higher education like in no other area. We lead the world also in technological and business innovation, which obviously relies heavily on what universities produce. If we are to inspirit ourselves and move public opinion to our side, we need to seize the flag and start telling a grand national story about our centrality in maintaining America's preeminence in the world. In fact, universities should consider joining together in a kind of NATO-style alliance that takes the fight to Trump. An attack on one is an attack on all. Trump is trying to divide and conquer us and trying to handle his administration's attacks each on our own, with each of our schools trying to cut deals with the administration to cover our assets and asses will not work. This alliance should also have a rapid response war room to respond to Trump's attacks, but not just that, to preempt and foil them. Our Brussels should probably not be Harvard or Berkeley. We should probably set it up at ASU or UNM or UNLV or Texas A&M. Trump and his minions aren't geniuses, to say the least. Did you see the formula they used to calculate the tariffs we're imposing on our trade partners? These folks should be easy for us to troll and roll. So let's grab the laser pointer and start making the Republicans the cats chasing the beam for a change. Our universities have countless smart, powerful advocates who could be activated. That means mobilizing alumni and institutional partners to stand up and fight with and for us. We need to leverage our countless potential partners in industry, entertainment, and the media. After all, they depend on our research, resources, and graduates to flourish. It's past time to start flexing our muscles to save our universities, which are the best thing our country has, and to take our country back as we do. You know, my dad always told me that I should always strive to put myself in places where I'm the dumbest person in the room. And I've actually often managed to do that, including here today. So I have no doubt that everybody here can think of better suggestions than I've come up with. So let's do this now while we still have the chance to act. Thanks so much, you guys, for hearing me out. I look forward to hearing your questions. Please.
So who knows about this strategy? Like, it seems like it's this great silver bullet. Who knows about it?
It seems like what?
It seems like a great silver bullet, this approach. So who knows about it? I need to know about it at the national stage. Anybody know this?
Are you on the New York Times bestseller list? Is what he's asking.
No, I'm not. I'm not. Okay, so strategists don't know this. The Democrats are still mired in this thought that, to the extent they think about things like dominance, they don't even use that language, that, well, that's what Trump does, so we better not do that. This is kind of a reactive, without recognizing that we have our own high dominance tradition. Right? Going back to Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass, certainly including FDR, JFK, MLK, Lyndon Johnson, obviously. They've come to think that anything Trump does is exactly what we don't want to do. I think that's part of the problem. There's also, 21st century Democrats have also kind of, we've evolved this kind of cult of pity, right? Where any expression of exuberance about our own accomplishments somehow risks being insensitive to those who still suffer. It's well-intentioned, but it's politically completely dysfunctional. What I found actually is I travel around with this argument and in looking at reactions to my book, that the people who absolutely get it and say, yes, 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 do that are Lincoln Project people like never Trump Republicans, and some people on the far left who actually really appreciate this among mainstream Democratic Party operatives. So they are still wedded. They're still wedded to this image, not of candidate styles and leadership actually determining how voters vote, but rather they have this image of, Jack and Diane six-pack sitting down to the kitchen table before the elections and pulling out a pen and paper and calculating which candidate's policies are going to bring us the most benefit. That never happens. Have you ever known anybody who did that? People, we vote our guts. We vote what's in, our instincts. That's the way it's always been. Maybe there was some time and some, we go back through the mists of the past when people actually behaved that way. They don't now. Democratic Party operatives still don't know it. They keep stepping on that rake because they don't know another way. And what I'm trying to do with my book and with the argument that I purvey in it is to get them to think outside that box and kind of clue them in to what Trump's superpower is. Trump's superpower is not his appeals to bigotry. He definitely appeals to bigots, but there aren't enough bigots left in the country to explain how Trump got half the vote. They seem to think that somehow, Democratic voters or middle-class people are so discouraged by their economic lot, even though they're actually not. So it's hard to get this message out, but I'm going to keep trying. Yes, please.
Not gonna work.
My name is Lisa Morris. I'm a professor of sociology and religion studies at Texas A&M University. I'm speaking not as an employee of Texas A&M, but in my own individual capacity. I just have to say that. I have been in a recent small meeting with our provost where someone suggested to him that wouldn't it be good for you to organize with other Texas universities as we face things, not just from the president, but from our state legislators who want to take away the role of our faculty senate as the owner of curriculum, who wants to say that taxpayer appropriations cannot be used to teach courses involving gender ideology. And said, why don't you band with all of these other Texas colleges and write an op-ed in the Dallas Morning News? And he laughed and he said, that's not how you influence legislation. And and so it's the faculty get it, right? The faculty get it. We get that we need to band together, but telling that to administrators, even when you're in a small group and with the council of principal investigators, he tends to listen to the people who are getting grants because they really want. We don't have any input. So anyway, I just leave that as an anecdote and do you have any suggestions? Asking as a private individual.
Honestly, I've seen the same thing out of so many university administrators. It's like once people go into admin, they just kind of lose their edge or they lose their, I don't know what it is about administrative positions, but even it's faculty moving into those positions. I think also there might be some adverse selection involved here. I mean, the kind of people who used to move into high admin positions in universities, this is going back to when I was in college in my early years in the profession, tended to be leading scholars. And, they regarded themselves primarily, and they were hired to be intellectual custodians of the university. These days, they're fundraisers. They're lawyers, they're consultants. They're people who aren't necessarily distinguished scholars, but who specialize in fundraising. And those kinds of people think differently, I think, than career-long committed researchers and teachers. That could be part of the problem as well. But we've seen this, the problem that you mentioned is right. We see it all over the place, right? And all I can say is I think it's time for us to go public. Go ahead and publish that article. Go ahead and publish it in the student newspaper as well. Let's not let our administrators like hold us back. Their instinct is to hunker down and protect our DEI programs and like hope it's all gonna blow over. And we know how Trump reacts to that kind of appeasement. It just, it just whets his chops for more, the same way that appeasing Putin does. So I think we're gonna have to step out and do it ourselves. Yes, please. Can you speak up just a little bit?
Yeah, sorry. So as we're talking about how the Democrats, their purpose in the United States is to uphold the status quo, pretending they're fighting for democracy. And I think that was most evident as we saw after October 7th, when the state of Israel began their genocide. A lot of the debate, I mean, those were pretty driven of Israel. Voters during this time, during the election, were kind of thinking about third. More third party.
Okay, no, we'll never see a third party in the United States. Everybody talks about this all the time. It can't happen. It can't happen given our system. Single member districts for congressional elections and an upper house, the Senate presidential elections. This dream of a third party is just a chimera. I mean, you can happen. You get a Ross Perot and you can get, 10 or 15% in the election, but nobody from a third party is ever going to win an election. And I have to say, I disagree with you at least a little bit on this notion that Democrats, regard their job as just upholding the status quo while pretending to fight for freedom. The Democrats are fighting for freedom, just fighting like wimps. They're fighting with one hand tied behind their back. That's the problem. And on the Gaza Israel issue, whatever one thinks about that issue, the fact is that Harris was way to the left of Trump on this. I mean, the notion that their policies were exactly the same. I mean, Harris wouldn't have ever come to office and said, okay, I'm going to take over Gaza. You can just clean out the territory and take those 1.5 million people, ship them off somewhere else. And, Jared Kushner's going to build some resorts there. That wasn't Harris's policy. And so, I think a lot of people who really side strongly with the Palestinians and against the Israelis found her stance, unacceptable. But Trump's stance was immeasurably, I think, more unacceptable. So I think even there was actually a meaningful difference between the parties. Trump could not have made it clearer. During the election, he said, it's time for the Israelis to just get this thing over with. It was crystal clear what he was going to do.
Very in support. Because the status quo is supporting Israel.
And it's always going to be the case. I mean, for an American politician to abandon Israel and to support the Palestinians, led by Hamas, would just be political suicide. And when I hear this idea that somehow Harris really blew it with young voters by not being tougher on the Israelis, I mean, there's absolutely no evidence of that in the data. The vast majority of Americans side with the Israelis. Now, I think you could easily make an argument that their response to October 7th has been disproportionate. I'm not even arguing about the substance of the question. I'm just saying in strictly political terms, I don't think that Harris would have been well served by allowing, Palestinian flags at the Democratic National Convention and so on. I just think that whatever you think about the issue in substantive terms, I don't think that would have benefited. Yes, please.
After Gaza, now Hungary, I am a Hungarian, and I think Orban is not kept in power because he's such a charismatic personality. He's kept in power, his party is kept in power. And the world system works like the democratic machines here in the US at times, in Tammany Hall, New York, Chicago. So they look after each other. They really help some people who vote for them. they punish enemies, local level, state level, etc., by the taking away resources from them and giving to others. So it is machine politics, and it is the work of many people, not one personality. So I'm in this case, it was not only presidency lost. The House was lost, and the Senate was lost to Republicans. And I think what Trump did, Trump hijacked the Republican machine information that was already very successful in many places, Florida, the Texas, that they introduced laws that were incomprehensible decades ago that we introduced.
All right, so I agree with you that Orban is actually not a charismatic, but he is extremely high dominance. And what you were describing is, essentially something out of the authoritarian's playbook. And it goes way beyond, Tammany Hall politics in the United States. It really does involve kind of colonizing all aspects of the Hungarian state and turning NGOs into appendages of the state and so on. And the way he did that, and you're right, of course, he used Fidesz, his party, as his organizational weapon, was through his battering ram, high dominance approach to dealing with his opponents, just like Trump did. So while you're right, absolutely, I agree that he set up these organizations and he used his political party, but how did he assert such dictatorial control over Fidesz? How did Trump exert such dictatorial control of the Republicans? Something's never happened on the part of a president, still more of an American politician, still more by someone who actually lost their first re-election bid. It was Orban's and in turn Trump's extremely high dominance approach. He went outside the party if he needed to and appealed to public opinion. And his party fell into line. So I still see parallels between the United States and Hungary. Yes, please.
I'm curious, what actions you personally are taking or considering taking about disseminating this information to Democratic Party leaders or possibly younger members of the party who are running for office?
I'm just trying to publish stuff. That's pretty much what I'm stuck with. I'm also doing podcasts. I'm going to a second edition. It's not going to be second edition, but it's Comeback, the book that Jennifer said that I wrote that came out actually in the spring, like 6 months before the election. I'm going to do an afterword for that book, and it's going to come out in a couple of months. We're actually explaining why Harris lost, talk a little about some of the issues I talked about today, and try to hammer home the fact that we basically had proof of concept for my argument in Harris's campaign. When she stepped out like a high dominance boss, she just completely overwhelmed Trump, and he shrunk. And then when she reverted to what I call low dominance norm, then she shrunk and Trump ended up winning. I mean, never before was a phenomenon so awful for democracy and so like good for an author's argument, right? It was just, I was amazed. I published an op-ed in the New York Times at the time the book came out. It was in early March, and it actually encapsulated bits of this dominance argument. And I have to say that during that first half of the campaign, everybody reads the New York Times, and that pointed to the book, that during the first half of Harris's campaign, once she stepped out, my ego was telling me that, wow, your arguments have actually, gained traction among Democratic Party operatives. And I didn't have direct evidence. I wasn't working with the campaign, and I wouldn't expect Vice President Harris to call me and say, thanks for the ideas. I was really blowing it before, and now I'm going to get my act together, right? But at any rate, what happened whether anybody's influenced or not during the first half of the campaign, during the second half of the campaign, she fell off. So what am I doing? Podcasts, trying to write more stuff, teaching about this, traveling around, trying to get the argument out.
Have you considered contacting them directly?
Yes, and I've been in contact with some Democratic Party operatives and some influential, kind of donor organizers, and some find the argument compelling. Somehow it's still, I think it's gotten through to some operatives in the Democratic Party. I think it might have gotten through to some Democratic politicians. So far, though, those politicians are not the public face of the party. The operatives still operate under what I consider these ridiculous assumptions about, voters making up their minds based on that kitchen table conversation before the election, or this idea that the party has to be unified on every issue before we can step out with an argument. It's just the way Democrats have come to think in the 21st century. Yes, please.
Yeah, to write about Elon Musk in your segmentation.
I'm sorry, Elon Musk.
Um,
No. I'm not going to mention Elon Musk. I've had enough of Elon Musk, right? It's not going to happen. Yes, please.
Well, to kind of return to the public space recently, having these town halls, the Republicans are refusing to hold town halls and that sort of thing.
That's nice. I mean, Walt showed us what he's made of. And frankly, Harris did. Harris is going to run probably for governor of California. And what she showed us during that campaign, she doesn't have the right stuff to beat Trump. She told us that she showed us at first that she potentially had it, but she couldn't sustain it during the campaign. And in California, you know, we need a leader, we need a governor who's going to stick up for us and stick it to Trump. And she's not that person. She just doesn't have what it takes. I think we do have stronger figures in the party. I love Adam Schiff, our senator from California. I'm gonna advocate him for president. I think he's absolutely terrific. Yes, please.
Is there something within the field of political operatives in terms of sometimes within a particular field, there's something that keeps people who feel engaged because their own job is at risk? Is there something about that field that prevents them from getting local inspiring because to shift to what they do is career?
You know, you would think that the career imperatives would push them to think outside the box and to change their ways because they just keep losing. And let's face it, you guys, if you could lose to Donald J. Trump, how off your game do you have to be? How off your game do you have to be to lose to Trump? This is the weakest candidate for president that we've ever had in the history of this country. You would think that their career imperatives would actually push them away from thinking the way they have. Still, there's this inertia, there's this mentality that I talked about that is keeping many from doing it. I do think that now they have to be more open to alternative arguments. It's so obvious that everything they've been doing is a loser. Yes, please.
Well, we saw on Tuesday, Wisconsin voters push back against Prime Minister Musk's effort to buy the Wisconsin Supreme Court seat. And then we're seeing some very deep red state legislative seats flipping blue all of a sudden, or Republican margins being cut down like in the Florida special elections. Why won't voter pushback, in your opinion, cause Trump and his minions to rethink what they're doing here?
It could, but we need leaders, right? And we need to get behind high dominance leaders. We need to actually, you know, because they're the ones who are going to run for office. They're the ones who are going to control the Democratic Party's messaging. So I find these trends encouraging. But remember, you know, the Democrats, you know, between the midterms and 2026 midterms and the presidential campaign, you know, they won every by-election, they won all these Senate seats. And we kept talking about how, wow, you know, voters are tilting toward us. And it turns out when people went out and voted in national elections, it didn't work that way. So, you know, I try to be heartened by every piece of good news I can get, but I don't find that news that you talked about all that compelling as a harbinger of the way people are going to act on the national level. Yes, please.
I wanted to revisit your answer on the independent candidate. Never say never girl. I'm listening to everything you're saying on dominance. That's key here. Listening to everything you're saying about Democrats and they can't be their act together. I understand that. So what's to say that an independent from one of the parties is going to say enough is enough and rise and be that dominant independent person? Why can't that happen?
I mean, Bernie Sanders is an independent technically. And I think that someone could arise, and I think what's going to happen is someone's going to basically, you know, be willing to stick it to their own party.
Yeah.
You know, you're gonna get some Democrat who's willing to tell a pronoun joke. And everybody's going to be apoplectic on the far left. And the whole center and even the right is going to sit up and say, what? He was willing to do that? It'd be good natured. But the point is that in the absence of people like that, you know, we're not going to be able to flex our high dominance muscles. On why an independent can't win, you know, I just go back to the logic of our system. It's a presidential system. We have single member candidate elections for House elections. We have a Senate. It's just it's, it's just impossible to imagine a third party rising up. You can imagine maybe the Democratic Party evolving into something else, or the Republicans, which we've already seen evolving into something else. But the idea that some third party candidate's going to come out and win, I think, is very unlikely. I guess it's not impossible. There's a moment, if you go back to 1992, and it looked like Ross Perot might at least come in second, right? It's George Bush and Ross Perot. I remember watching the McNeil-Laird NewsHour. I'm dating myself here. How many of you guys remember the McNeil-Laird NewsHour? And one of the guests said, this is now a two-man race between Ross Perot and George H.W. Bush. Bill Clinton was supposedly out of it. And of course, we know how that turned out. I just think it's very hard for single party candidates. For independent candidates to get elected in a system that's structured the way ours is.
We have time for.
Yes, please.
One last question.
So Donald Trump lost in 2020 to Joe Biden. Was Joe Biden then the high dominance candidate in that race? Or
No.
Was the fact that Donald Trump beat two female candidates part of the equation?
No, actually, Biden was not the high dominance candidate, but he was higher dominance than he became later on. I think you could remember the way he handled Trump. There were moments where he was actually, very effective. I think, his age really got the better of him. Biden is not himself a naturally high dominance politician, but like so many other politicians, he's a mix of traits, high and low dominance traits. Obama was the same way. And let's remember, and I'm glad you brought this up, dominance isn't all that matters. Dan McAdams and other political psychologists make this distinction between what they call prestige qualities and dominance qualities. The dominance qualities are your ability to really lord it over others around you and impress them with your strength. And prestige qualities are more about your expertise and your ability to work with others and so on. Those qualities matter as well. It's just that McAdams points out that the desire for dominance is deep in our DNA, and it preceded our desire in evolutionary terms for what we now call prestige leaders. The Democrats always win on prestige. Right? We always win in terms of our superior knowledge of governing and our ability to deal with other people and how nice we are and how much we care and all that other stuff, right? But the problem is that Republicans win on dominance. That wasn't enough for Trump to win in 2020, especially with COVID taking 1,000 lives a day and unemployment, reaching 15%. We don't know what would have happened. I suspect Trump might have been reelected at that time without that disaster. But, to your point, dominance isn't always enough, but it does matter an awful lot.
Excellent.